Thank you for joining the Oxford Climate Society first event of term. This is a first online event of an 8-week series. My name is Shobin. I'm the Vice President of Oxford Climate Society. I am a PhD student at Oxford doing battery research to develop sustainable battery chemistries to support renewables. Oxford Climate Society is a part of Oxford University aiming to develop the next generation of climate leaders. We have weekly events and educational programs such as our School of Climate Change, which we run throughout the year. We also run the largest student-run climate journal in the world, which is called Anthroposphere. And in addition to this, we are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and actually incorporate climate on the curriculum. So the theme of today's event is what is the impact of the COVID-19 economic crisis on the energy transition? For those of you who don't know, the energy transition is transformation of the whole energy sector from a carbon-intensive, fossil fuel-based system to a clean energy, zero carbon system. And this is critical in order for us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, beyond which the consequences become much more severe. So the coronavirus has caused an economic crisis, which is now considered to be the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. And to put that in context, US unemployment is now double that suffered at the worst point in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. So given the severity of this economic downturn, what does this mean for the climate crisis and the energy transition? Will tackling climate change now take a political backseat? And how can governments ensure economic recovery whilst also progressing towards clean energy? So to provide some insight into these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by two world-leading experts in energy, Michael Liebreich and Laszlo Varro. Laszlo Varro is the chief economist of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, where he heads the Economics and Investment Office. The IEA is the world's highest authority on energy, advising governments and industry on energy policy and solutions for climate change mitigation, energy security, and energy affordability. The IEA also published a major report today on the impacts of COVID-19 on energy demand and emissions, which we'll discuss more in detail during the talk. Michael Liebreich is the chief executive of Liebreich Associates, where he provides advisory services for across the energy sector. And he was founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is one of the world's leading clean energy research organizations. And he remains there as a senior contributor. So we're going to start this event with each speaker giving a short speech with their thoughts on what's happening now, and then we'll progress in what should happen or what governments could do to improve the energy transition and economic recovery. So thank you very much for joining us. I will be followed by questions from myself, and we'll finish with questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for either of our speakers, please write them in the chat box that's on the right-hand side, and we'll try and get through as many as we can at the end. So thank you so much, Michael and Laszlo, for joining us.
Thank you very much. As always, I have already learned quite a lot just listening to Laszlo go through that list of what is happening. What I'd like to do is, if I might, just start by taking a step back and looking at where were we before COVID, because I would say, considerably more optimistic than most, I think it's fair to say. So at the end of last year, I wrote something saying peak emissions is closer than you think, and here's why, in which I explained that I expect to see peak emissions during this decade, the 2020s, and I actually forecast that emissions by 2030 would be down by about 5%. And this is CO2 emissions from energy. So you have to look separately at land use and a bunch of other things. But CO2 from energy would peak and would start to come off from the peak by 2030. And the reasons for that were, number one, that we've actually made a lot more progress than the zeitgeist, than the kind of current social environment would suggest. You know, you have Greta Thunberg, who's done an amazing job at raising the awareness of the climate challenge, saying, you know, you grown-ups are all useless, you've done nothing. In fact, what's happened, if you go back to 2013 and you look at the last 6 years, in 4 of the last 6 years, there has been no growth or virtually no growth in emissions. So 2014, 15, 16, and 19, there was no growth in emissions. 17 and 18, there was growth. But during that period, economic activity grew by 23%. So that's GDP growth. GDP is a horrible measure of happiness and lots of things, but it measures activity and jobs quite well. That grew by 23% in that last 6-year period, but emissions only grew by 3%. They only grew by 3%. Now, you wouldn't guess that by following the public debate and the listening to Extinction Rebellion and so on. You would not realize just how close we actually were to the peak of CO2 emissions. And so, in fact, it wasn't that much of a risk for me to say, well, I think we're going to see the peak, because the other thing that's happening is why were emissions being sort of removed from economic activity? Basically 3 reasons. One was energy efficiency or energy productivity. We were just getting more GDP, more growth, more economic activity out of less energy. The second thing was a shift from coal to natural gas. It gets an enormous amount of airplay. If you ask most people, they would say that's the only trend that's happening, that all this renewables is pointless and a waste of time. The third factor, and it's actually almost as big as the coal to gas shift, is actually renewables. And renewables, the point there is both the shift from coal to gas, but also the shift from coal and gas as well to renewables. These are penetration curves. This is based on a substitution of one technology for another. And substitution curves follow a kind of S-shaped process, right? They start very slow, then they speed up, and then at the end they slow down again. And you can digital telephones penetrating into analog smartphones, into digital phones, color TV into black and white. Any transition has that characteristic of starting slow, speeding up, and then slowing down right at the end. And there's lots of modeling about it. The analogy I draw is that 0 to 1% substitution just takes forever. Of almost anything, you have those early adopters and they go on about it, but most people don't adopt new technologies. And then you reach a point, 1 to 5%, where suddenly you realize that it's inevitable, and you get investment and you get everybody saying, well, my next car will be electric or whatever it is. So you know there's going to be a kind of, I call it, it's like a sneeze. You know it's going to be explosive. You know it's going to take off. You don't quite know when it's going to happen. And then once you go through 5%, then the thing really takes off and you get very rapid change. You get restructurings, you get bankruptcies. It becomes completely obvious that this was always going to happen. All those people who said that this couldn't possibly happen go quiet or suddenly become the new champions and so on. And the point is that and you can think of examples in energy. LED light bulbs, you go back 7 or 8 years, they were way too expensive. Nobody bought them. I was probably the only one. But now they're ubiquitous, right? More than 50% of new light bulbs everywhere in the world are LEDs, and it's clearly going to continue, and then eventually it'll tail off some special uses. Plug-in vehicles, plug-in cars of some sort in Norway, they trundled along and then suddenly they took off, and we saw within 5 or 7 years, there's no reason fundamentally, not in the electrical system, not in charging points, nothing. It takes off and off it goes. The third example, UK coal. 8 years ago, about 40% of electricity in the UK was produced by coal. This year, it's going to be less than 2%. 8 years, 50%, 40% change in proportion. So we're at that point where a lot of technologies, not just wind and solar, but actually electric vehicles, batteries, battery combinations that can actually beat, battery solar combinations that can beat natural gas, even things like high voltage DC, the costs are coming down, the penetration, the use in the energy system is increasing. And so we're going to see an acceleration in the next 10 years. Now, that's a long way of explaining why I was optimistic. And then, of course, COVID comes along. And the first thing it does is, as Laszlo explained, it reduces the demand very dramatically by in this quarter by 15% in electricity and 30% in oil and much more than that in aviation fuel. And over the course of the year, it'll be somewhere around 7-8% in, I think it's 8%, the IEA's figures for emissions and all the figures that Laszlo has given us. And the question then is, what's going to happen? First of all, how does it bounce back? I'm also not a doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I do know that you're not going to get a rapid return as long as the virus is on the loose. And some food for thought in transportation. We're all supposed to, as we unlock, move back into normal patterns, start going on public transport. And if you impose social distance on a bus or on a tube train or on a light rail or metro train or a train, then you probably reduce its capacity by about 80%. Think about it. If you've got no standing, because you can't have people standing near people sitting, and if you've got 3 out of every 4 seats roped off, because you can have one person over there, then one person over there, and then one person 2 rows back on the left and 2 rows back on the right, and the front 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows near the driver are roped off, you've got a very empty vehicle. So this is going to be a huge drag on urban economies. You've got the huge drag of the hospitality industry, which isn't going anywhere quickly because it's just simply not, people are not going to feel comfortable going to restaurants, going to pubs. The whole travel industry is going to bounce back very slowly. And then, of course, there's all the people and organizations, companies, charities, and even governments who will have enormous balance sheet stress. So we could see a bounce back to, let's say, we'll see a bounce back to 90% of activity. I think that's going to be generous. And it's going to sit there until such time as this thing rolls through and we get either a vaccine or immunity or something. And it may take another couple of years after that for it to get back to the levels of activity that we saw in 2019. We'll get on to discussing what the governments should do in terms of green stimulus. But one thing they're bound to do is a whole bunch of just simply trying to kind of reflate the same souffle. They're going to throw money into protecting balance sheet or trying to pump the liquidity into the market. I've no doubt they will do a whole bunch of stupid things like accelerating mega projects because that sounds good and it makes it sound like they're doing something. We have to remember that in the bounce back from the financial crisis, although there was a reduction in emissions, it was quickly followed by the largest ever growth in emissions. In 2008, there was a drop. 2009, it bounced back. And Laszlo, I suspect, has got the numbers, and I'd love to hear them again because they're quite salutary. So we're going. The risk is that we get that sort of short-term action by governments, and I think. We'll come on to what they should do, but I want to talk about one other thing that we're going to see, because the question is really, is this economic heart attack? First of all, the health impacts taken as read, we're all very concerned about, but the economic heart attack, is that going to speed up or slow down that 5% drop by 2030 that I was expecting? And I think it is going to speed it up. I think we're going to take 3, 4, 5 years to get back to some sort of a normal economic life where we've both able to, we're not scared of going out without catching because we might catch a deadly disease, but also the general population has got money in their pockets and is not feeling absolutely traumatized. I think that takes, let's call it 2 to 5 years, 2 to 4 years, 2 to 5 years. At that point, I suspect emissions may well be back near where they were in 2019, but they would have been ahead. We were going to see them increase before dropping off. I think they have dropped dramatically, and I think they'll float back up. Now, the reason I think that we will then see them come off more rapidly than we would have is behavioral change on a number of different dimensions. We are right now using a technology that I suspect none of us used 3 months ago. I'd heard of Zoom. I had never used it. I'd never live streamed on YouTube. I've had countless meetings, and it works. It's absolutely clear, I'm going to do less business travel as a result of COVID, even years into the future. It's a big tragedy for me because I earn a good chunk of my money by doing public speaking at conferences. This is not the biggest problem in the world, but we are going to see changes in business travel. We're going to see changes in home working that are sticky. People don't want to go into the office. It's not economically efficient to spend an hour and a half a day commuting to and from the office. They will go in. Many people will want to work at home for some period. They'll work maybe a couple of days a week at home, maybe 3 days in the office. Others will work 4 days at home and only go in for meetings. There will be some proportion of work that obviously will have to take place at the place of work. But we're going to see this kind of iron grip of presenteeism. You have traders who are trading energy or bonds or whatever, and they need to be in the office to do that, really mainly because of the ego of their team leader, who thinks that they are somehow inspired and under better control if he is in the room with them. There are countless examples. So we're going to do more home working, home medicine, primary care. We are never going to go to a GP's office to get a repeat prescription again. Routine hospital meetings, all of those people jumping on transport just to go off and get their results of some test that they did. All of that is going to seem it already seems absolutely quaint, and it's not coming back. Home education, very interestingly, every single parent I know can't wait to stop home education. But for older children and for students, it's absolutely clear it's going to have an increased place in the curriculum. There's absolutely no reason why, if you have a motivated student, they can't continue to, they can't attend their lectures whilst also being in a pleasant environment, not necessarily even in the same country. This is all nonsense, trying to force people to sit face to face with supervisors as often and so on. So there's going to be huge amounts of change in those sectors. Supply chains are going to get shorter. 3D printing has had an incredible, there's an incredible change in incredible uptake of 3D printing. You just have to hear about the medical visors that are being printed and the parts for ventilators. It works. There's going to be a lot more of that. And the other thing is there's going to be a psychological change to do with resilience. I hope that there will be there'll be a return to, in a sense, understanding. This is a generation, all of us, not just students from Oxford who might be watching this. All of us have become complacent. All of us have accrued risk in our lifestyles. The very, very extended supply chains for all sorts of goods. We don't even know where the risks are. We have people who are dependent on drugs. They don't even know what the precursor chemicals are, where they come from. Of course, they don't know. They haven't needed to know. Nobody, but the point is, nobody, not even the professionals, have cared. We are now very dependent on the electricity supply. Laszlo talked about that process of electrify everything that you can, and I agree. That's what we need to do. But we must also realize that we are building up risks in the system. We are connecting the electrical system with the transport system, with the payment system, with the communications system, with the food and agriculture system, with the medical supply chain system, and so on. And nobody, as we now know, before COVID was really, there were some warning noises and some people were concerned, but nobody really, no governments were giving this, maybe the Singapore government, you could say, and maybe potentially a couple of others, but really not. And I think we're going to go into a period where people understand resilience in a different way. It's going to slow down some. Is the travel tourism industry ever going to return to exactly? Are you going to get, for instance, New Zealand, where 10% of the economy is dependent on long distance tourism? You sure that's wise? You sure that's smart? In a situation where there are more risks, more volatilities, and so on in the world, I think there's going to be some thought about that. It could be that this will also translate into thinking about risk from climate change. It could be that there are some people who were previously dismissive who now say, actually, do you know what? The long, accretive, geometric progression that we saw in the pandemic actually is the pandemic was just a speeded up version of climate change. I've got to be honest, I'm worried about this because I actually think that the reaction of those, I don't want to, deep contrarians who really wanted to do nothing about climate change seem to be, a large proportion of them seem to be responding to COVID by saying we're overreacting, right? Which I don't think we are. I think that when you have 200,000 deaths after taking such dramatic measures, I think that's proof that we're not overreacting. That puts it in, it makes it, I think, the third or fourth worst pandemic in the last 70 years. And that's after taking these measures. But also we see that people taking lessons from COVID that reinforce their priors. And I worry that they will do that also with climate and also on this resilience point. So instead of saying, well, we've had this big shock, we need to protect ourselves through better international action, better cooperation, they might well say we need to protect ourselves better by domesticating our supply chain, domesticating all agriculture, domesticating the pharmaceuticals industry, and building a huge wall. And that's another possible reaction that we might see. And with that, I'll hand back to Shobhan because I think he wants to drive us into say, or lead us into talking about what we might do about this, the sort of the future that we've laid out so far.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. That was really, really great. I think you're exactly right. I just my main questions are then, what can we do, or what can governments do to kind of accelerate the kind of transition to a clean energy system and use this as an opportunity rather than, as you say, spending money on wasteful assets and assets that might not be even worthwhile in a few years. And so kind of what would a good stimulus program actually look like? And how likely is it we're going to get that? And so that good stimulus program to ensure economic recovery, but whilst also facilitating the clean energy move. And I would say, what are the most important technologies or initiatives that should be supported with this? Are they renewables directly, or is it supporting infrastructure such as, I don't know, batteries or high-speed rail or something like that? So Michael, do you want to start and then?
Sure, I think so. There's a great debate that has started and is going on about green stimulus and trying to build back better. What I would caution is that there's a lot of naivety. It's a debate amongst people who are already convinced that we should do a green stimulus and build back better. The people who are not having that debate is everybody else, which broadly speaking is right now the majority, because there's all the people who don't really take climate and sustainability that seriously in the first place, plus all the people who are just extremely stressed economically and would just regard any discussion about green and sustainable as being, some complete, we've got to understand, we are having that debate now in the middle of the health crisis and in the middle of the economic heart attack that the global economy is having. So I think that there are some things that you'd like to see. You asked, well, should it be infrastructure? There were projects that were approved during the 2008-9 financial crisis that didn't get built until 2015. That's not a stimulus, that's a self-indulgence, right? So what we've got to do is we've got to look, in terms of the stimulus, we need to have a large amount of short-term programs and initiatives that put money into people's pockets quickly. And inevitably, that is not kicking off large new projects. It is doing stuff that is distributed across the economy and doing it quickly. So it's got to be things like energy efficiency. And as I said, that makes no sense economically when the gas price is so low. So absolutely, that's got to be ground zero of any green stimulus. If you don't want the yellow vests to be out on the street saying, why are you talking about hydrogen? I haven't eaten. I'm being kicked out. I can't pay my rent. And you're talking about Crossrail 2, or you're talking about some mega project, high-speed rail. And no. we've got to put money, energy efficiency puts money into the pockets of electricians, builders, plasterers, et cetera, et cetera. Solar rooftops, maybe it's not the best, most efficient, most cost-effective production of energy, but it is a piece of the matrix. And I think putting solar and batteries and heat pumps into homes on a large scale, these are the sorts of programs that can get lots of people to work. I would like to see, if you want to get really forward thinking, I would like to see things like, why don't we in the UK try and get 50,000 homes off the gas network in the next 2-3 years? That would be a massive, massive challenge. We're going to have to do that sort of thing in order to address climate. And if you could imagine, each home that you're trying to get off the gas network is probably going to employ, and it's going to be several good weeks of work, maybe even months of work, by crews of quite large numbers of people. I mean, it's going to be half a dozen people, maybe 10 people, and it's going to roll through and it's going to take months. It's difficult, right? So those sorts of distributed programs are much, much better than the mega project thinking. And I got to be honest. And by the way, there's one other thing I want to mention, which is that although we're focused on the oil price crash and now the gas price crash, quite rightly, and it makes it hard, it makes it harder to do energy efficiency. Don't forget something else. Money is free. Money is free. We're printing a load of money. The helicopters, hopefully there'll be electric helicopters by the end of this period, but the helicopters are dropping money now or they will be for the next 5 years. So whilst you've got very low cost oil, you've also got very low cost finance. And all of the clean energy technologies, they're all capital up front. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, even nuclear, which is not a quick answer to the COVID stimulus, but all of them, high voltage DC power lines, batteries, electric vehicle charging stations. That's another good distributed type program that you could kick off, would employ a lot of people very quickly. They will all get cheaper at the same time as the oil and gas prices are low. So I'm much more optimistic that they will remain competitive and that the money, I think Laszlo said, renewables money will still flow. But I think we've really got to prioritize the things that put money into the hands of tradespeople. It's not the top. In the recovery from the financial crisis, 1 decade after, the US economy, the household savings increased by $55 trillion. Half of that went to, 75% of that went to the top 10%. And half of that went to the top 1%. If that happens again, then I think there's going to be there's going to be, I don't want to say there's going to be an uprising because I don't want to use those sort of emotive words, but I think that the social fracturing that we've seen, the contrarianism, everything from populism to yellow shirts to resistance to climate change to fake news, it's going to get much worse. We've got to put the money into the pockets of the people who need it at large scale quickly. And that should be the number one test of everything. We will do green stuff and mega projects and so on, after that. The only caveat is, of course, I put lots of money into R&D so that lots of wonderful Oxford researchers and engineers and others could be back in the labs as soon as is safe, working on the next generation of innovations. But that's just a concession to Oxford. I want to, if I might add a couple of other things to the kind of wish list of the green stimulus or the Build Back Better. One is around electrification of transport. Again, to my point about being very careful about yellow vest type pushback, what we can't do is to say, oh, well, let's stimulate the economy by giving money to rich people to buy an electric Volvo or an electric Mercedes or a Tesla. This has got to be more sophisticated than that. And one idea there is there are some companies that are doing extremely well right now during the COVID period. And I'm thinking of the home delivery companies. I'm thinking of Amazon. I'm thinking of grocery deliveries, the parcel delivery companies. It would be very easy and politically popular to say, look, one thing we have not hated, we've enjoyed about the COVID period is the air quality in our cities, which has been improved. We're going to lock that in. There's some companies that have done very well. They've made good money. they've got good balance sheets, they're bankable, they can borrow money. You're going to be off internal combustion delivery vehicles by 2023, 2024, whatever, choose a year. And that would create not just, I mean, it would create a air quality benefit, but also it would create demand for the car companies. So instead of giving them a bailout and saying wait for demand to come back, or you can reduce the cost of just doing a generic cash for clunkers, you would then put I call it a wall of demand. Every delivery vehicle, every taxi, every bus, every private hire vehicle, if you add those in, you get a lot of demand. And let them figure out, instead of just having lots of government employees deciding where to go and build charging stations, create the wall of demand and let them decide where they want, and let them demand the charging stations. Let them push the demand for charging stations. Of course, you can do a bit of bump priming as well. The other thing is on, I talked about a bit briefly, mentioned cash for clunkers. We're going to have this period, we've got low energy demand across the board. I don't think it's going to bounce back quickly. You've got excess capacity. We must retire the dirty stuff, whatever that takes. And some of the stimulus monies need to go to the fossil industry, supply side and demand side, because if not, there'll be just the almightiest pushback, lobbying, slowing everything down, etc. So there's a lot we can do to take, you don't want to just pay somebody to shut down what's effectively already a stranded asset. If you're going to do that, then make sure that there's a condition that they have to reinvest in clean capacity. But there's a lot of things that we can do to take out, and it could be across the board, could be in transport, could be in electricity generation, could be in industry. Use this period of low demand, obviously to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. That should be blindingly obvious, but also to shut down excess capacity, second thing. But the third thing is even things like remediating orphan wells, removing flaring, fixing fugitive emissions. These are all things that require money. They're distributed and modular in many cases, to Laszlo's point, and they would put money into the pockets of people who are, who have also lost their jobs. They just happen to have been in the fossil industry. One of my neighbors is an oil field engineer. He's unemployed. The company's shut down. They fired him. That's it. He's done. Doesn't know how to feed his kids. Well, he could remediate. There's going to be an awful lot of work to downsize some of, or to deal with the aftermath of the fossil fuel industry. We shouldn't be all precious about it and say, oh, that's not green and we mustn't put anything, No, we've got to also think about building down, and by the way, the education sector, reskilling people, taking that oil field engineer, and when he's finished capping off wells that are no longer needed because of the low oil price for the foreseeable future and then the lower demand, he could be he could transfer his skills into mining. Mining sector is going to require an enormous amount of skills because we're going to be mining copper, we're going to be mining lithium, we're going to be mining cobalt, we're going to be mining nickel, all sorts of things. And let's shift even people from fossil sector. We've got to think about what is their role in a transition to a net zero economy, and not be precious about supporting them, because otherwise you'll just be feeding the opposition to the whole transition.
Thank you. Given the time, I'll move on to audience questions. I've got a good one here, which is from Stuart Hillen. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on how COVID will impact COP26. Obviously, it's been postponed to next year, and how will pledges and current policies be adhered to, and also what will the impact of the politics of COVID, WHO, and China have on the negotiations that take place next year?
I think it's fantastic. Well, it wasn't fantastic news because the reason why it was postponed was very tragic. But it is really a great thing that COP has been postponed, because I think if it was taking place at the end of this year, the temptation would be to sort of put something together to be able to declare a victory, which would only convince people who are already convinced that COPs were a good thing and that climate action was necessary. I think it would have been an extremely difficult, apart from the fact that, clearly the preparations had not been smooth, not just the firing of Claire O'Neill, but, you can go back to the failure effectively of the last two COPs, both of which very disappointing. The last one a clear and present failure, which didn't exactly give you a good momentum going into it. I think that by postponing it to 2012, I think that we have a chance of it being a magnificent kind of almost like the 1948 Olympics. The Olympics were cancelled during the war, Second World War. And then 1948 was a magnificent bringing together. It was a reaffirmation of civilian life. It was very inspiring. Yes, it was a little bit ad hoc, but we have a chance of that sort of a COP coming out of this, because hopefully we will have seen the recovery. At least we'll have line of sight. I don't think the world's economies will have recovered. And by the way, I think that the Olympics in Tokyo probably will have to be delayed again. I just can't see how they will be doing that. But at least we'll have line of sight on a recovery. Hopefully, there will be a better understanding of some of the stuff that I talked about earlier, that we are making progress. We're making much more rapid progress than we thought. I've been waging warfare against the very extreme climate scenarios, RCP 8.5, the most extreme catastrophe scenario that everybody likes to talk about, which is absolutely not on the cards. It is not a probable, not a likely, not a possible, not an even slightly possible. It's an absurdly unlikely scenario. Hopefully by the end of next year, there will be more general understanding that actually we are in the sort of, the thing that we're fighting for is not to be at 7 degrees or 5 degrees of global warming. We're actually probably on track for somewhere under 3 degrees, probably, maybe a bit over, but probably under 3. And what we really need to do is to bend the curve more, and we'll get down to 2. My own view, you started this show by talking about 1.5 degrees. My own view is 1.5 degrees at some point we're going to have to admit is impossible, just given the inertias in this incredible complex sort of set of differential equations. I don't see a solution that is within the realms of economic, political, social possibility of getting to 1.5, whilst also recovering from COVID, bringing people out of poverty, bringing women into the workforce, educating children, improving healthcare, all the other good things that we've been doing. But that's something of a digression. I think that we can have a magnificent COP. I think it needs to really, the goal has to be to recover the spirit of Paris, this extraordinary, it was an unexpected success. There was really a period where 195 or 198 countries did something that surprised even themselves. And we need to get back to that. Can we do that if President Trump is re-elected? I think it's very, very difficult. I have more freedom than Laszlo to speculate and to let my opinions and my views be known on that presidential contest. I think a president that has just been presiding over mass graves and what's clearly going to be 70,000 deaths, and you compare it to South Korea, it's absolutely clear that there's been an absolutely abject response, abject preparation at the federal level, and any justice would suggest that any candidate would be preferable to the current president. But then I've been a never Trumper I've always been a never Trumper. I'm reinforced in that by this ghastly, lethal performance that we've seen over the past few months. So, but it's impossible to call. That's my view. But I don't know what the outcome will be. We are seeing China take over global leadership. You are seeing it. You will see it in the WHO. The US steps away from the WHO. That is not a smart thing. That is a really dumb thing. That is, even if there are issues with the WHO, it is conceding the battlefield. They're conceding the battlefield on the UNFCCC process. the climate negotiations are nothing to do with environment and sustainability. They are economic and trade negotiations, and the US is stepping away. It's the most unbelievably foolish thing you can imagine. And it's very negative, by the way, for the outcomes that I care about. Because Chinese leadership, yes, there are far more engineers and far more scientists in their leadership. They're going to take climate more seriously. They're going to transition. But this is a repressive, centralized non-democracy. And if you look at what they're doing in terms of the actions they're taking against the Uyghurs and so on, I personally believe that the world will be a much better place if the leadership was at least evenly distributed, if and opened up, but fundamentally around the values that were in place that led the values which the world tried at least to implement over the last 50 or 70 years since the Second World War. So I am optimistic on COP, but I'm very pessimistic if the US does not course correct quickly and start to create a counterbalance to this very authoritarian, centralized, and illiberal trend that we see through Chinese leadership. And I respect all that they've done in clean energy, the investments, the technology, brilliant and wonderful. But I think the picture of an emerging world, even if we've dealt with climate change, is far worse than if we actually get the big Western democracies working well. Europe has to avoid a meltdown. The US has to get back on side. We have to see places like Australia, which showed such amazing leadership during the Second World War, and then now seems to have sort of checked out and decided that, well, Australia is too small, it can't do anything. Absolute nonsense and rubbish. We need to see this thing, some of this clockwork needs to be put back together in time for the COP meeting in December next year, and hopefully we'll get that spirit of Paris back. And then I'm unbelievably optimistic.
Sounds great, thank you. There's been a few questions about what the economic impact of COVID will be on green infrastructure and emissions in the global south, and how the West can support them with, for example, sustainable international finance post-COVID, and whether that will happen. So I wondered if you could give some thoughts on that.
I can add that I'm very worried about the global south in the coming couple of years because of COVID. Partly because I think they're going to be very badly hit. I think it's tempting to say, well, they've got this kind of young age structure, but they still love their old, they still love their parents, their grandparents, and I think that there's going to be enormous suffering. I don't think we've seen that really start. Sadly, I think we're starting to see some of the countries. It's maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the experience with Ebola in Africa and maybe public health will be able to intervene more quickly. But I'm very scared that we might see the sort of thing that we've seen in Iran. I can't see why you wouldn't see that in Afghanistan or in across all of Central Asia. Like I say, maybe and Brazil, I think, is having trouble even reaching the peak. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried about ongoing investment in sustainability, the transfers from north to south, largely because I think the north is going to be under a lot of financial strain itself, and therefore the ability to funnel money down to the south is going to be limited. I think the development banks have got a huge role to play, but they're actually modest. The amount of lending out of the World Bank Group, if you compare it to the trillions that are needed in the next decade in the energy system, there may be a few $100 billion across that decade, but it's not many trillions, which is what's needed. Just on a lighter note, I'm on the advisory board of something called Green Map, which is just being set up. And it's being set up to replicate a mechanism that was used in Argentina. So Argentina under Cristina Kirchner was, nationalizing things, became uninvestable, became a financial sector pariah. Macri, this is not an ad for Macri's government, which made many, many mistakes. But one thing he did do was employ a really, really smart guy called Sebastian Kind, who created a mechanism of nested guarantees, which he's now formed Green Map and is trying to replicate across other countries. And it enabled $7 billion of investment into Argentina's, principally their wind sector, in about 2 or 3 years, straight after the period when they had been nationalizing Repsol and doing all sorts of the most absurd economic things you can imagine. So as a result, you'll see that Argentina has gone from 0% renewable energy to nearly 18%, about 2 or 3 years after the money started to flow. An incredibly successful program, and that debt is robust. Those nested guarantees are actually working. So it can be done, and we need to see a lot more of it. But I think the overall macro environment and the healthcare environment that we're operating in these global south flows, I believe is going to be very negative and very painful for a couple of years.
Okay, thank you very much. What could I quickly ask? What do you think will be the implications for the oil and gas industry? You've mentioned, Laszlo, you spoke about the massive declines in oil and gas use is expected this year, but what will happen? Will we see a pivot towards them becoming energy companies? We saw Shell cut their dividend for the first time since World War II. Is this a signal of change, or will it be just a lot of protection until demand can recover?
I'll just add a few comments using the same sort of 3 buckets. The shale companies, there'll be many bankruptcies. The assets will, to a certain extent, they'll run down. They'll be shut in. 2 million barrels is Laszlo's estimate. I don't have a better figure. The important thing, though, is that they will be sitting there. Those resources, those assets will be sitting there, ready to open up again when the oil price rebounds. The cost of capital will be higher because they will have lower access to debt. But they will have access. In America, you have access to capital. That's kind of a given at a price. So they'll have a higher cost of capital, but they'll have a lower cost of services. And so they will be competitive at oil prices. I'm going to say $30, $40 comes back, and they will be operating again. Maybe not the same level as before, but there's no reason to believe that there won't be a large rebound in the volumes of unconventional oil. Taking the third group, I'll do the second group. The international oil companies, we sort of think that these things are almost like monolithic. There's always been Shell, there's always been Exxon, there's always been Total, there's always been Chevron. So no, every so often there is a realigning of the chips. And I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see M&A activity even amongst the majors because the stress on the balance sheets, and although they're healthier than the American miners, they are not immune to pressures from the capital markets. And already there's strong arguments for separating off, recombining, whether it's the new energies piece, which should have separate access to the capital markets, or whether it's the older oil assets, or and of course, there is a fourth group, by the way, which is Canadian oil sands producers who are who have had the most extraordinary wake-up call. But I think we're going to see some very substantial M&A activity, stress-driven M&A activity. When it comes to the national oil companies and the oil producers, their fiscal break-evens, the oil price they need to function as a society, is in many, if not all cases, higher than the shale oil producers in the US. So if shale oil is profitable at $25, $30, $40, these countries, Saudi Arabia needs an 80, I think IEA's figures, $82 or $84 fiscal break even. So any oil price below 84, and the country is simply not able to continue funding indefinitely the social programs that it's running. So when Laszlo says that it's going to be a very profound wake-up call, it is going to be a more profound wake-up call in due course, even than the shale sector in the US. And I'm not optimistic about their ability to restructure their economies. I think that there's going to be a number of them failing economically. And I think that that is going to be unbelievably painful for those countries. And I think they're going to export some of that pain regionally. I expect some of it to translate into regional conflicts. And I expect it to get really ugly. And in summary of all of that, one thing we know, well, two final points. One is that there is a dramatic reduction in exploration and development activity across the oil sector. Right? So with those cutbacks in capital spending, they translate into lower oil capacity later. If the economy bounces back robustly, that could lead to another price spike. I believe it'll be absorbed by a lot of shale coming back into the market. But we could see the seeds being sowed for another price spike, which would be very negative for the economic recovery. The other thing is the summary of all of this at the macroeconomic level is that the cost of capital for the oil sector is going up. So we're going to enter a period of 5, maybe 10 years where the cost of capital for renewable energy is going down because governments helicopter money, et cetera, and the cost of capital for fossil assets and fossil businesses is going up because of the unbelievable volatility, the price crash. Maybe there'll be a price spike, but it won't change the fundamental problem that that sector is going to have to deal with is a cost of capital problem, which will underlie and will play out right across the sector. To the good of the climate, it has to be said, but through incredible pain and possibly some very unpredictable things along the way.
Thank you very much, both. I think that's all we have time for. Unfortunately, I could keep asking questions, but I would like to say, if do either of you have any final remarks or just a final comment to leave the viewers with? Michael, you can start.
Yeah, I have a final thought. I hope we have some viewers, because it's been really, I love discussing with Laszlo. What you don't know is we get together periodically and we do this over a few beers. We'll have to do it virtually for the foreseeable future, but I learn an enormous amount from Laszlo. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope we have viewers out there who have also enjoyed it. And it would be hard to think of a more interesting, challenging, and important set of questions. So good luck grappling with them. We're all grappling.
Both of you, thank you so much for joining us. It was absolutely fascinating talk, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure all the viewers have. I'd just like to conclude by saying that this live stream can hopefully will be able to be uploaded, but we'll let you know if in due course. And then our next event is actually this coming Monday at 5 p.m., which is on consumer behavior and social behavior that we've been speaking about today, but it's on changing social norms and behavior change for the climate. And we have Professor Elke Weber, who is Professor of Psychology at Princeton University, talking, and Kevin Green, who is the Vice President for the Center for Behavior and the Environment at the organization RARE. So tune in if you're interested, and for more details, just check our Facebook page and our website. But thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and take care and good night.